Hey everybody, Bren here, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be continuing on with our Dragon Sicilian Speedrun. And we are playing an open dragon, it looks like. Unless they play some sort of weird move that doesn't allow it. Well, they allowed it with g6, so that's what we're going to do. And Bishop d3 is not really the move you want to be playing in these dragon setups. So I'm quite happy here, actually. I think we've gotten a lot out of the position, and yeah, nothing to really be upset about. So now we have to ask ourselves how to develop further. There's two ways we can develop, knight c6 or knight bd7. This is the age-old question. Generally, knight c6 is good if you're putting pressure on d4 and they've played something like c4. Knight c6, we're not really threatening to take on d4 because we would just improve their center. This is kind of a common thing I've mentioned quite a bit in these types of dragon positions. So because of that, I'm actually looking more towards knight d7. It can always go to c5 or e5. It just feels a little bit better there, I believe. So this is kind of where I'm favoring. So knight bd7. And knight to d2. So if you play b6 and allow knight c6, it's a little awkward, but I'm just going to play the move a6 instead. And I'm going to play queen c7, b5, and bishop to b7. This is kind of my goal here. I want to prevent e5 if I can. And it looks like we have, which is great. We can also play knight e5 here, which is a very interesting move. And actually, I'm considering it. So knight e5 is one of those strange moves where we're just trying to force an exchange off. And the way we should look at it is we can treat this almost like a Benoni in a weird way, where we do have a few pieces fighting over this d7 square. So if you can trade one or two of them off, I think that benefits us a little bit. So playing something like knight e5, even if they take and double our pawns, make our bishop slightly worse, I don't actually think that's a bad thing for us. Knight to f3, and then all of a sudden we can just kind of develop naturally with moves like bishop e6 and h6. Queen d2, we can meet with king h7. And yeah, our pieces kind of find the right squares, which is nice. Sure, our bishop's not the greatest, so that is something to mention. I think because our bishop isn't the greatest, I want to take a different approach. Now knight c5 is quite good. I'm just realizing. Knight to c5, this pawn is only defended once, and if they find another defender, we actually win the bishop pair. So this is another way to kind of force a trade of one of these three pieces, and I think that's a better way to do it. So knight c5 is the answer. If they move their bishop away, trying to keep their bishop pair, they lose the pawn. And that's much more serious than losing the bishop pair in the first place. So, yeah, we just take the pawn here. We can move back when we're ready. Being up a pawn is a huge deal. It's always a big deal, especially when there's not really compensation for it. I like b5, but I also don't mind just bringing my knight back. We could also try moves like e5, d5. Really just trying to gain as much space as possible. This looks good too. e5, d5. Is there a reason not to do that? I'm struggling to find it. But b5 and bishop b7 is kind of just like a little bit more preferred by me. I'm not sure if I can describe why. I think it's mainly because I want to focus on development, right? I could always play d5 instead. And then if I really want to, somehow, I can just play e5 right after. That's a safe way to do it as well. Let's play d5. This just defends our knight instead of moving it. We do have e5 on the horizon as well, which is quite nice. Everything is defended here, so I'm not really that concerned. I'll play b5. What they might try is just taking, with the idea that this pawn is going to be undefended if we take it with the knight, but I'll take it with the pawn. Here, this does not work. And this doesn't work because we're actually attacking this bishop. So it looks like we're getting a winning position pretty quickly in this game after knight takes c5. And that's game over. So let's check out the analysis board here, shall we? Change over. All right. So everything was fine for our opponents here. Bishop d3 is kind of just a way to play around defending the e4 pawn in a standard way. Normally, when you do something like this, you're trying to play for c4. At least this is my impression. Because the only thing wrong with knight c3 at all, like the only reason knight f6 is played is because you're trying to, obviously you're developing with tempo, which is good, but why not something like knight c6? This is also a developing move. And there's a good reason for that, is because the best option is to play knight c3 and block the c-pawn. Because, for example, if we play something like knight c6, now all of a sudden c4 is available. And after c4, they get this grip over the center. This is something that Dragon players are going to be very familiar with. And I would say this is one of the things I would worry most about, besides the mainline Yugoslav attack. Though, then again, Dragon players usually like playing into those things and are definitely prepared against it. This one, I think, is underrated and definitely causes black quite a bit of problems. So that's why you play knight to f6 in the first place. You avoid this line altogether, and if they play something substandard like bishop d3, all of a sudden there's no more bishop c4, which is really nice. And also they no longer are defending their knight. There's just problems with any other way to defend the pawn. Same thing with f3. You could play f3 in an attempt to try to play either like bishop c4, knight c3 anyways, and it's just a different move order, but I'm not really sure why you would play f3 instead of just knight c3, which is a developing move. So yeah, just a lot of nuance there, but it's all really, really good stuff to know, and yeah, just keep that in mind. So g6, bishop g7, castles, and already we have a better position because our opponent's kind of just wasting time, right? They're making moves that may help their position a little bit, but there's bigger things that you can do. You want to maximize your potential in every position, right? You want to make the most of every single move. So when you make moves like h3 as opposed to something like castles or queen e2, it is a waste of time. So castles. I think knight bd7 was a good try here. I see that the engine is favoring us a little bit more, but I kind of stand by knight bd7 as opposed to knight c6. Knight c6, as you can see, the engine doesn't like it as much because we're not really threatening to take on d4, whereas knight bd7, we're threatening knight c5. So after knight to d2, we're not really threatening knight c5 here because it is defended sufficiently, and we don't really want to do this willy-nilly. For example, if we play knight c5 here, bishop c2, we can't really take on e4, and we let them play bishop c2. So that's why something like a6 is a little bit better. Now, knight to f3, I'm just realizing I could have played something a little bit better here instead of queen c7. And this is another example of, hey, you want to maximize your move every move. Queen c7 wasn't really the best way to go. They should probably play something like bishop c2 here. Instead, we can actually just play knight c5 now. And all of a sudden, we are actually getting the bishop pair immediately, and we're not letting them get out of any possibility of keeping it there. So I prefer that move quite a bit. But all right, queen c7, still a fine move. Bishop e3, and now knight c5 just causes direct problems, I believe. Now, we could have played something like maybe e5 even. I wouldn't be surprised if this is a strong move, and it appears to be. And the reason why is even though we are weakening the d5 square, there's a bit more going on in the position. And what's going on here is they don't really have a way to target this square. They have a pawn on c3. If they could play knight e2, c3, knight d5, then sure, their position seems quite decent. But that's just not going to happen. It's too far away. After knight to e2, we can already look at moves like knight to c5. Even d5 doesn't look too silly here either. Just trying to blow up the center and threaten to take the pawn like this. Because if they take, then e4 actually just wins a piece here. So Knight c5 instead, take the pawn, d5, and yeah, we just end up with the winning position here. So this doesn't look like it was necessary, unfortunately. Maybe something like rook to d8 was better. Is there anything much better? I was thinking of e5 here, but I wasn't so sure. But I guess e5's quite strong still. Yeah, e5 is very strong, just covering central squares, getting space. So I didn't really have to play something like b5, which allows them to take, and then play something like this. I think that this might be the best way to play against it, but it could be wrong. Anyways, yeah, bishop c5, we take the piece and we win the game. So I would say the most important thing to remember here is if your opponent tries to play some weird move to defend the pawn, I'd say f3 is going to be the second best option as opposed to knight c3. But moves like bishop d3 or like queen e2, there's usually always something wrong with it. Defending the e4 pawn is always a little bit tricky for white to do. And knight c3 is going to be generally the best option. So yeah, keep that in mind for your games. But that's about it for this one. I hope you guys enjoyed and learned something, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.